Welcome to Brain Upgrade. There comes a point in some people's lives when every familiar source of support begins to disappear. Relationships change, friends become distant, family members may no longer understand what they're experiencing, plans fail, expectations collapse. For many people, the brain interprets these events as a serious threat because humans are biologically wired for social connection. Our nervous system evolved to depend on trusted relationships for survival. So when those connections are disrupted, stress circuits become highly active, cortisol levels can rise, attention becomes narrowly focused on perceived danger, and the mind starts searching for immediate relief. This is one reason emotional pain can feel remarkably similar to physical pain. Brain imaging research has shown that regions involved in processing physical discomfort can also become active during experiences of rejection or profound social loss. From a biological perspective, isolation is not simply an emotional experience, it is something the brain treats as a potential survival challenge. But there is another side to this process that often receives far less attention. The brain is extraordinarily adaptable. It constantly reorganizes itself according to what we repeatedly focus on, believe, and practice. In neuroscience, this capacity is referred to as neuroplasticity. While painful experiences initially activate stress responses, they can also create an opportunity for entirely new patterns of thinking and emotional regulation to develop. This transformation rarely happens overnight. It occurs through repeated moments of choosing where to direct attention, how to interpret suffering, and what source of stability to rely upon. When external validation disappears, many people discover how much of their emotional state depended upon the opinions, approval, or presence of others. Compliments temporarily elevated confidence, encouragement reduced anxiety, affection created a sense of security. None of these experiences are inherently unhealthy. Healthy relationships are essential for psychological well-being. However, when identity becomes almost entirely dependent upon external affirmation, emotional stability becomes fragile because it is controlled by circumstances outside one's influence. Imagine spending years believing your worth depends on being appreciated, understood, or constantly needed by others. The moment those conditions disappear, the brain begins generating questions that can quickly spiral into self-doubt. Am I enough? Did I fail? Why did everyone leave? These thoughts are not random. They emerge because the brain continuously attempts to predict future outcomes using previous experiences. If past security depended on people, then losing people feels like losing safety itself. This is where faith can become psychologically significant. Genuine faith is not simply repeating comforting words during difficult moments. It functions as a stable framework through which uncertainty is interpreted. Rather than seeing every setback as evidence of personal failure, faith introduces an entirely different perspective. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" the question gradually becomes, "What am I being prepared for?" That shift may appear subtle, but from the standpoint of cognitive neuroscience, changing interpretation changes physiology. The meaning assigned to an experience strongly influences the intensity of the body's stress response. Researchers studying resilience consistently find that individuals who possess a strong sense of purpose often recover more effectively from adversity than those who do not. Purpose provides direction during uncertainty. Faith often provides both purpose and meaning simultaneously. When someone genuinely believes that their life remains guided even when circumstances become confusing, uncertainty becomes more manageable because it is no longer interpreted as complete chaos. The nervous system begins responding differently when uncertainty is paired with hope rather than fear. This does not eliminate grief. It does not erase loneliness. Emotional pain remains real, and acknowledging it honestly is healthier than suppressing it. The difference lies in what happens after the emotion appears. Instead of remaining trapped inside cycles of fear, resentment, or despair, attention gradually shifts toward trust, patience, and acceptance. These repeated mental practices influence neural pathways over time. The brain becomes more efficient at returning to calm after periods of emotional activation. Another important aspect involves attention itself. The brain cannot maintain equal focus on every possible source of information. It prioritizes what appears most relevant. When someone spends every waking moment searching for evidence that they have been abandoned, the brain becomes increasingly skilled at detecting signs of rejection. This creates a feedback loop where isolation feels even more overwhelming. Conversely, intentionally directing attention toward gratitude, prayer, reflection, and meaningful action strengthens entirely different neural networks. These practices do not deny reality. They simply teach the brain to recognize that suffering is not the only truth present. For a woman who finds herself with no one but God, this shift often becomes deeply transformative. The absence of external voices creates space to hear an internal one that may have been drowned out for years. Decisions become less influenced by social pressure and more aligned with deeply held values. Emotional reactions become slower and more deliberate because there are fewer distractions competing for attention. What initially felt like unbearable silence gradually becomes an environment where clarity develops. There is also an important physiological dimension to practices like prayer and quiet reflection. Slowing the breath, reducing external stimulation, and engaging in focused contemplation can activate parasympathetic pathways that help regulate heart rate and reduce physiological arousal. This state supports clearer thinking, improved emotional regulation, and better decision-making. While spiritual practices differ across traditions, many share these common effects on the nervous system. They create conditions in which the brain becomes less reactive and more capable of thoughtful responses rather than impulsive ones. Over time, a remarkable transition can occur. The same woman who once feared being alone begins discovering that her greatest source of stability was never the constant presence of other people. Instead, stability emerges from an identity rooted in something deeper than changing circumstances. Confidence becomes quieter but stronger. Peace becomes less dependent on favorable outcomes. Decisions become guided by conviction rather than approval. From the outside, others may simply notice increased resilience. From the inside, however, the transformation is much more profound. The mind no longer measures safety by the number of people standing nearby. It measures safety by the certainty that even in complete solitude, purpose remains intact, hope remains possible, and faith provides a foundation that circumstances cannot easily remove. One of the most misunderstood experiences in human life is being alone. Many people automatically assume that being alone and being lonely are the same thing, but neuroscience and psychology suggest they are fundamentally different states. Loneliness is the distress that comes from feeling disconnected, unseen, or unsupported. Solitude, by contrast, is the intentional or accepted experience of being by oneself without necessarily experiencing emotional suffering. Two people can spend the same afternoon alone, yet one feels abandoned while the other feels deeply restored. The difference is not the environment, it is the way the brain interprets the experience. The human brain is constantly evaluating whether an experience represents safety or danger. When a woman suddenly finds herself without the relationship she once depended on, the nervous system often interprets this change as a threat. Stress hormones increase. Thoughts become repetitive. Attention narrows toward everything that feels uncertain. This response is not a personal weakness. It is part of the brain's survival system, designed to encourage reconnection with supportive social groups. Throughout human evolution, isolation often meant increased vulnerability, so the brain developed mechanisms to make separation feel uncomfortable. However, there is another remarkable feature of the nervous system: it adapts. What initially feels threatening can gradually become a source of strength if the experience is approached with intention rather than fear. This process depends largely on repeated exposure combined with meaningful interpretation. Every time someone chooses to remain calm in moments of solitude instead of immediately escaping through distraction, the brain learns that being alone does not automatically mean being unsafe. Over time, the stress response begins to decrease. This is why many high-performing individuals deliberately create periods of uninterrupted solitude. They understand that clarity rarely emerges in environments filled with constant stimulation. Every notification, conversation, opinion, and expectation competes for limited attentional resources. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning, decision-making, and emotional regulation, functions best when it has opportunities to process information without continuous interruption. Solitude gives the brain exactly that opportunity. For a woman whose only constant companion becomes her faith, solitude often transforms from something she fears into something she protects. Without the constant pressure to meet everyone else's expectations, she begins noticing patterns she never had time to recognize before. She becomes aware of recurring emotional triggers, unhealthy habits, and beliefs that have quietly shaped her decisions for years. Self-awareness increases because external noise decreases. There is also a biological reason reflection becomes more effective during quiet moments. The brain contains interconnected regions, often referred to as the default mode network. This network becomes especially active during periods of rest, reflection, and inward attention. Rather than focusing on immediate external tasks, the brain begins organizing memories, evaluating experiences, and constructing a more coherent understanding of personal identity. While excessive rumination can become harmful, intentional reflection allows experiences to be integrated into wisdom rather than remaining unresolved emotional burdens. Faith introduces another important dimension to this process. Instead of allowing the mind to endlessly recycle fear, regret, or resentment, prayer and meditation provide a structured direction for attention. Attention is one of the brain's most valuable resources. Wherever it repeatedly goes, neural pathways become stronger. If attention constantly returns to loss, feelings of hopelessness often become more deeply ingrained. If attention consistently returns to gratitude, trust, forgiveness, and purpose, different emotional patterns begin to dominate. This does not mean difficult emotions disappear. Sadness still visits. Grief remains part of healing. Questions continue to arise, but the relationship with those emotions changes. Instead of becoming overwhelmed by every feeling, a woman gradually learns to observe her emotions without allowing them to dictate every decision. This capacity is one of the strongest predictors of emotional resilience. It reflects the ability of higher brain regions involved in cognitive control to regulate activity within emotional centers such as the amygdala. Purpose also plays a critical role. The brain tolerates discomfort much more effectively when discomfort is connected to meaningful goals. Consider how athletes willingly endure exhausting training because the effort serves a larger objective. The same principle applies psychologically. When solitude is viewed merely as punishment, motivation declines. When solitude becomes preparation for future growth, the identical experience is interpreted very differently. Meaning changes biology because perception changes physiology. Many women discover during seasons of isolation that they become less reactive to criticism. This happens because their sense of identity slowly shifts away from external approval. If confidence depends entirely upon praise from others, criticism becomes devastating. But when identity is anchored in deeply held values and spiritual conviction, opinions lose much of their emotional power. The brain gradually stops treating every disagreement as a threat to survival. Another fascinating change occurs in decision-making. Constant social influence often creates internal conflict because the brain attempts to satisfy multiple competing expectations simultaneously. Remove those competing voices and cognitive resources become available for clearer thinking. Decisions become less impulsive. They become guided more by long-term principles than short-term emotional reactions. This shift reflects stronger engagement of executive control systems that prioritize future outcomes over immediate emotional relief. There is also growing evidence that regular contemplative practices support healthier regulation of stress. Quiet prayer, intentional breathing, reflective reading, and moments of stillness encourage activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, the branch responsible for recovery and restoration. Heart rate slows, muscle tension decreases, breathing becomes more efficient. The body begins signaling to the brain that immediate danger has passed. Over weeks and months, these repeated experiences help create greater emotional stability during future challenges. Perhaps the most profound transformation occurs when a woman realizes that silence is no longer empty. It becomes a place where wisdom develops. Instead of needing constant reassurance from people, she begins trusting the quiet confidence that comes from living according to principles she believes are eternal. Her peace is no longer dependent upon having the perfect relationship, the perfect circumstances, or the approval of everyone around her. She discovers that solitude, once feared as evidence of loss, can become the environment where courage grows, emotional resilience deepens, and an unshakable inner foundation is built. One quiet decision at a time, the human brain has a remarkable ability to assign meaning to every experience. Long before we consciously analyze a difficult situation, neural circuits are already asking an important question: what does this mean for my future? If the answer is uncertainty, the brain often prepares for danger. Heart rate increases, attention narrows, muscles become tense, and stress hormones begin circulating throughout the body. This response evolved to protect us from immediate threats, but in modern life, uncertainty is often emotional rather than physical. A broken relationship, financial hardship, betrayal, or prolonged loneliness can activate many of the same biological systems that once helped humans survive predators and harsh environments. Yet there is something equally remarkable about the nervous system. It does not simply react to events, it reacts to the meaning we assign to those events. Two individuals can experience nearly identical hardships while producing entirely different emotional outcomes. One becomes consumed by fear and hopelessness. The other develops resilience, patience, and extraordinary emotional stability. The circumstances may be similar, but the internal interpretation is profoundly different. This is where faith becomes far more than a comforting idea. At its deepest level, faith provides a framework that changes how uncertainty is processed. Rather than viewing hardship as meaningless suffering, faith allows the mind to interpret difficulty as part of a larger purpose. From a psychological perspective, this shift is significant because the brain is constantly searching for patterns that reduce uncertainty. When uncertainty is paired with meaning instead of despair, the nervous system often becomes more capable of maintaining emotional balance. Researchers studying resilience consistently observe that individuals who possess a strong sense of purpose tend to recover more effectively from adversity. Purpose acts like a psychological compass. It does not eliminate obstacles, but it prevents the mind from becoming directionless. A woman who believes that her life still carries purpose, even during seasons of isolation, approaches challenges differently than someone who believes everything has been lost. Her attention shifts away from asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and toward asking, "What can I become because of this?" That change in attention is incredibly powerful because attention shapes the brain itself. Every repeated thought strengthens certain neural pathways while allowing others to weaken. If the mind repeatedly rehearses fear, rejection, and hopelessness, those networks become increasingly efficient. The brain becomes better at detecting additional evidence that confirms those beliefs. This is one reason anxiety often feels self-reinforcing. The brain learns to expect danger because it has practiced searching for it. Faith interrupts that cycle by redirecting attention. Instead of constantly rehearsing worst-case scenarios, the mind begins returning to trust, gratitude, patience, and hope. These are not merely positive emotions. They are repeated cognitive habits that gradually influence how the brain processes future experiences. Over time, this repeated practice strengthens emotional regulation and reduces the tendency to become overwhelmed by uncertainty. An important aspect of this transformation involves surrender. In everyday language, surrender is often misunderstood as giving up. From a psychological standpoint, healthy surrender means releasing the illusion of controlling everything that cannot actually be controlled. Much of human suffering comes from investing enormous mental energy into outcomes that remain outside our influence. Relationships, other people's opinions, unexpected losses, and future events cannot be fully controlled regardless of how much time we spend worrying about them. The brain naturally seeks certainty because certainty conserves energy. Uncertainty requires continuous prediction and adjustment, which consumes cognitive resources. Faith offers something unique by allowing a person to stop carrying the impossible burden of controlling every outcome. Instead of constantly monitoring every possible threat, the mind gradually accepts that some aspects of life remain beyond personal control. This acceptance often reduces chronic stress because the nervous system is no longer attempting to solve problems that have no immediate solution. For a woman whose deepest trust is placed in God, this surrender often becomes one of the greatest sources of emotional strength. It does not remove responsibility or effort. She still works, plans, learns, and makes thoughtful decisions. But she no longer believes her peace depends entirely on producing perfect outcomes. That distinction changes the emotional experience of daily life. Failure becomes information instead of identity. Delays become opportunities for growth instead of evidence of abandonment. Waiting becomes an exercise in patience rather than a source of constant frustration. There is also growing evidence that practices associated with sincere faith, including prayer, contemplation, and gratitude, support healthier regulation of the autonomic nervous system. Slow, intentional breathing during prayer naturally influences physiological processes connected with calm attention, heart rate becomes more regulated, muscle tension decreases, and emotional reactivity often subsides. These changes create conditions in which the prefrontal cortex, responsible for judgment and self-control, can function more effectively even under stress. Another transformation occurs in identity. Many people unconsciously define themselves according to roles or relationships. They identify primarily as someone's partner, someone's daughter, someone's friend, or someone's caregiver. While these relationships are valuable, they can become unstable foundations for identity because circumstances inevitably change. When those roles disappear, people often experience profound confusion about who they are. Faith offers an alternative foundation. Identity becomes rooted in something that does not fluctuate with success, failure, popularity, or rejection. This creates remarkable psychological stability because self-worth is no longer recalculated every time circumstances change. Confidence becomes quieter but far more durable. It no longer depends on applause, approval, or constant reassurance. Perhaps the most profound change is the development of hope that remains independent of visible evidence. The human brain naturally prefers immediate proof before believing positive outcomes are possible. Faith challenges that tendency by encouraging trust even when answers have not yet appeared. This is not denial of reality, it is the willingness to continue acting with integrity, discipline, and courage despite incomplete information. From the perspective of performance psychology, this mindset protects motivation during prolonged uncertainty because effort is no longer dependent solely on immediate results. As this pattern repeats over months and years, a woman gradually becomes emotionally different. Her nervous system becomes less reactive to temporary setbacks because her perspective extends beyond the present moment. Her decisions become guided more by enduring values than shifting emotions. Her confidence becomes less visible but far stronger. And while the world may only notice her calm presence, what has truly changed is much deeper. Her mind has learned that lasting peace is not created by controlling every circumstance, but by anchoring itself to a source of purpose and trust that remains steady even when everything else around her changes. There is a profound difference between appearing strong and becoming genuinely unshakable. Many people can project confidence when life is going well. They speak with certainty, make bold decisions, and seem emotionally stable. But real strength is revealed under pressure. It becomes visible when expectations collapse, relationships change, prayers seem unanswered, and the future remains uncertain. These are the moments when the nervous system is tested most intensely. The question is no longer whether someone can succeed when conditions are favorable. The question becomes whether they can remain emotionally grounded when everything familiar has been removed. For many women, the greatest transformation does not begin when life becomes easier. It begins when external support becomes limited, forcing them to discover an internal source of stability that had always been present but rarely depended upon. At first, this process feels uncomfortable because the brain naturally seeks predictability. Familiar routines, trusted relationships, and social approval all provide signals of safety. When those signals disappear, the nervous system initially interprets the change as instability. Yet the brain possesses an extraordinary capacity for adaptation. Repeated exposure to uncertainty, when combined with meaningful purpose and consistent emotional regulation, gradually reshapes neural responses. What once triggered panic eventually produces patience. What once caused emotional overwhelm begins to evoke thoughtful reflection. This is not because the challenges become smaller. It is because the person confronting them has fundamentally changed. One of the clearest signs of this transformation is a shift in identity. Early in life, many people unknowingly construct their self-worth from external circumstances. They feel valuable when appreciated, successful when praised, and secure when accepted by others. While encouragement is healthy, depending entirely on outside validation creates emotional instability because approval is unpredictable. Opinions change, relationships evolve, circumstances fluctuate. If identity depends on those variables, emotional peace fluctuates alongside them. A woman whose confidence becomes rooted in her relationship with God begins operating from a different foundation. Her value is no longer recalculated every time someone misunderstands her, rejects her, or overlooks her efforts. Instead of asking, "What do people think about me?" she gradually asks, "Am I living according to the principles I know are true?" That shift may seem subtle, but psychologically it changes the entire decision-making process. Internal conviction begins replacing external approval as the primary guide for behavior. From the perspective of neuroscience, this transition reduces unnecessary cognitive conflict. The brain constantly weighs competing priorities. When someone attempts to satisfy every expectation placed upon them, mental resources become divided. Every decision requires balancing personal values against fear of criticism or rejection. Over time, this creates chronic stress because the nervous system remains in a state of continuous evaluation. However, when core values become firmly established, many everyday decisions require less mental effort. The prefrontal cortex can allocate attention toward purposeful action instead of endless self-questioning. Emotional energy that was once spent seeking validation becomes available for growth, service, learning, and meaningful relationships. This is one reason individuals with strong internal conviction often appear calmer under pressure. Their minds are no longer occupied by constant concern over how they are being perceived. Another important transformation involves emotional resilience. Resilience does not mean suppressing sadness or pretending pain does not exist. Healthy emotional regulation begins by acknowledging difficult emotions honestly. Fear, disappointment, grief, and uncertainty are natural responses to hardship. The difference lies in what happens after those emotions appear. Rather than allowing temporary feelings to determine permanent decisions, emotionally resilient individuals create space between emotion and action. This space is one of the greatest strengths the human brain can develop. It allows higher-order cognitive systems to evaluate situations objectively instead of reacting impulsively. Prayer, quiet reflection, and intentional pauses before responding all strengthen this capacity over time. Instead of immediately reacting to criticism with anger or rejection with despair, the mind learns to observe emotional signals without becoming controlled by them. Faith reinforces this process by introducing a longer time horizon. The brain naturally prefers immediate rewards and immediate certainty. Waiting often feels uncomfortable because uncertainty activates stress systems designed to encourage action. But trust in God teaches patience in a way that directly challenges this biological tendency. It reminds the mind that not every answer must arrive today and not every delay represents failure. This perspective reduces emotional urgency and creates greater psychological flexibility. There is also an interesting shift in attention. Earlier in life, attention may have been consumed by comparison. Social approval, appearance, achievements, or relationships become constant reference points. Comparison activates reward and threat systems simultaneously. Success can produce temporary satisfaction, while perceived failure often produces discouragement. This cycle becomes exhausting because there is always someone with more recognition, greater accomplishments, or different opportunities. As dependence on God deepens, comparison gradually loses its influence. Attention shifts away from measuring life against others and toward becoming faithful in one's own responsibilities. From a cognitive standpoint, this frees enormous mental capacity. Instead of tracking everyone else's progress, the brain focuses on consistent personal growth. Progress becomes measured by integrity, discipline, wisdom, and character rather than external status. Another hallmark of inner strength is the ability to remain compassionate without becoming emotionally dependent. Many people confuse kindness with people-pleasing. They sacrifice boundaries, neglect their own well-being, and seek acceptance by constantly meeting others' expectations. Eventually, this pattern leads to emotional exhaustion because identity becomes tied to being needed. A woman anchored in faith learns that compassion and healthy boundaries can exist together. She serves others willingly but does not derive her entire sense of worth from their approval. She forgives without enabling harmful behavior. She loves deeply without abandoning wisdom. This balance reflects emotional maturity because her actions are guided by principle rather than fear. Perhaps the greatest evidence of lasting transformation is quiet confidence. It is not loud, defensive, or attention-seeking. It does not need constant recognition because it draws strength from a source that remains unchanged by public opinion. This confidence allows a woman to endure seasons of silence without assuming she has been forgotten. It allows her to continue acting with integrity when no one is watching. It enables her to make difficult decisions without requiring universal agreement. Over time, people around her notice something different. They notice that criticism no longer easily unsettles her. Delays no longer produce panic. Success no longer creates arrogance, and failure no longer destroys hope. Her peace becomes remarkably consistent because it is no longer built upon circumstances that continually change. Instead, it rests upon a foundation that remains steady through uncertainty, loss, waiting, and unexpected challenges. When a woman has no one but God, she may initially believe she has lost everything. Yet with time, discipline, faith, and reflection, she often discovers that what seemed like the end of her strength was actually the beginning of a deeper resilience, one that no external circumstance can easily shake. Thank you for watching Brain Upgrade. If you found value in today's video, subscribe, share it with someone who needs this message. And remember, the greatest transformation doesn't begin when life gets easier. It begins the moment your mind becomes stronger than your circumstances. See you in the next episode.